So, everybody has a story. It's such a simple idea. It's almost a cliche, in fact. But actually, what we find in narrative, in the work that we do in storytelling in the world day after day, is that actually that idea that everybody has a story becomes very profound in practice. And it's at the core of what we do at Narrative. We have 6 principles, and this is our principle number 2. Everybody has a story. It's actually Narrative's origin story. I'd like to step you back into 1994 in New York, which was the height of a previous pandemic, the AIDS pandemic. And Murray Nossel, who is one of the founders of Narrative, was newly arrived in New York from South Africa. He was a clinical psychologist, and he had arrived in New York and was doing an anthropology PhD. And as part of his studies, he was invited to set up a group at an AIDS Day program in Brooklyn. So this was a place where people could go to for medical help, for legal help, to get fed, to do art therapy, all kinds of things. But these people at this time, and I guess we should remind ourselves, in the early 90s, the prognosis, if you had an HIV diagnosis, was very poor. This was before the antiretrovirals. So the situation that Murray found when he started work at this AIDS Day program was a place where every week when he arrived, there might be a black rubbish sack on the counter that contained somebody's belongings, somebody who from the previous week had died and nobody had come to collect their things. And maybe there would be a small brass plaque that would go on the wall with their name on it. So Murray arrives in this place. There's the black rubbish sacks. There's a sign outside that says, "Caution, hazardous human waste." And he goes down into a basement, into a room with no windows. And there are a group of people waiting for him to work with them, to offer them something. And he says, "So tell me how you feel," right? He's a clinical psychologist. How do you feel? And the answer he gets is, "Well, how do you think I feel, Murray? How do you think I feel? I know that I'm going to die. My family don't talk to me. They've disowned me. And I'm pretty sick of people asking me how I feel. So don't ask me how I feel." And so Murray asked a different question. Alongside his work, outside his work, he had a passion for theatre. And so the question that arose for him was, "So tell me your story." To which they would reply, "I don't have a story. I don't have a story. My story is one of scoring drugs or turning tricks in alleys, and nobody wants to hear my story. I don't have a story." And Murray would say, "That is your story, and I want to hear your story." And one woman in the group said, "I have a 3-year-old daughter, and she's never going to know who I am. So, Murray, I'm going to tell you my story, and I want you to record it so that she has something of who I was after I'm gone." So Murray recorded her telling her story, and then she went outside into the common room and she said, "This guy is okay. You should do this." And then week after week, more and more people began to come and were sharing their stories. These people who were at the end of their lives with, nothing to offer aside from their listening and their stories. And they gave their listening to one another, and the generative effect of their listening, which my colleague Dan talked about yesterday, created the stories that they told, and Murray filmed them. So this stack of videotapes got higher and higher, and I think it was by Christmas 1994, the room was full. And those videotapes were eventually taken to Albany, which is the state legislature of New York State, and were used to affect changes in the law around how people with HIV and AIDS were treated. So that was the beginning of our work at Narativ, as storytelling as advocacy, using the power of your personal story to affect change in the world. And now, because storytelling is so universal, I would say, we do storytelling, personal storytelling, in many different contexts, and we work with a lot of leaders. And so what leaders say, and this is another version of I don't have a story, very often a leader will say to me, well, it's not about my story. It's about my team, or it's about my organization, or it's about the people that I serve. It's not about me telling my story. So here's the so what. Why should leaders be thinking about telling their own stories? Well, in the first place, your story is with you all the time, whether you know it or not, and whether you tell it or not. We see the world, we experience the world through the filter of our own experiences and our own stories. So as a leader, well, pretty much as anything, our story is always going to be with us, and it's going to be shaping how we are in the world. And working with our story is a fantastic tool of self-reflection. I heard Artem and Esther talking about this a little bit earlier. You know, I have a number of leaders that I have a coaching relationship with. And when I think about the work that I do with them, and they come, you know, their leadership is in different forms. One is a head teacher of a large school. One is the director of CRM at a global company, and the other is an entrepreneur with a big wellness brand. But for all three of them, this idea that actually thinking about their story can help them to process where they are right now, so they can get a handle on the present. And then by looking back at where they've come from, at their origin stories and their milestone stories along the way to the present, if they can understand that, the past, then they have this snapshot of past, the trajectory to the future, to the present, and then from the present into the future. So you can see how that, as a leader, how that trajectory is going. And if it's not going the way that you want it to go, it means that you can course correct. So it's fantastic in terms of thinking about strategy and where you're going as a leader. But having this understanding of now, the past, and showing you your future is a really vital role that storytelling as reflection serves. And of course, storytelling is an amazing communication tool, but I'm pretty sure that I don't need to be telling any of you that, because you've all signed up for this online conference. So I know that you're all on board with that idea of storytelling being great for communication, but maybe let's pull apart a little bit about exactly why. So as a leader, and if we're thinking about personal stories, why is it important for you to share your personal story? So as a leader, when you tell your story, you connect. You connect with your team, with your clients, with the world outside whatever your business is. So storytelling creates connection. And if we're talking about telling stories to your team or to your clients, the way that it works, because of the way that our brains are hardwired for story, when you tell your story, it connects, and then it unconsciously gives permission for the person that you are sharing your story with to connect to and to share their own story as well. So it creates this rather beautiful loop of connection. I share my story, that has a generative effect on you telling your story, which then generates more story for me. So that's the thing in storytelling that creates empathy, and it does that very, very rapidly. And that's in the way that our brains are wired. We talk about us being hardwired for story. You know, if I was to tell you a story about being on a beach with my dad when I'm 5 years old, if you scanned my brain, you would see my brain lighting up as I connect to the memory, the salt water, the cold wind on the beach, my dad's brown tank top, the feel of the rocks under my feet. So you would see my brain lighting up. But if we scanned your brains too, we would see your brains lighting up. So different time, different dad, different beach, different everything. But the mirror neurons in our brain would be firing simultaneously. So that's the thing that's creating empathy and connection in storytelling. So a couple of examples of where we at Narativ have seen organizationally the impact it makes when everybody shares their story. A number of years ago, we did a training at Turner Contemporary, which is a big art gallery on the east coast of England. And so we arrive into this big training room with massive windows and the sea crashing against the walls. And I'm in a big circle of people. And there's a lot of chatter in the room, a lot of excitement about what we're about to be doing. And there's one woman who isn't talking. She isn't smiling. And she's sitting with her arms crossed. And in the course of this training, which included everyone from the gallery, so whether it was somebody who cleaned the gallery, who worked in the shop, who was a curator, who was a director, everybody was there in this training room. And it turned out that this woman, with her arms folded, I think worked on the front desk of the gallery. And we put people into pairs to share their stories. And she happened to be in a pair with the deputy director of the gallery. So he told her a story about working with the architect as they were designing the gallery. And she told him a story about being a long-term unemployed person. I think she was unemployed for 7 years. And then this gallery opened up in her town and she got a job there. He listened to and valued her story. She listened to and valued his story. At the end of it, she was beaming and she came up to us and she said, you know, at the beginning of the day, I really wasn't sure about this. And now I have to say that it was really moving and I don't know why. And the director said to us, that was amazing, just hearing everybody's stories. I think we're going to remember this for a very long time. Another example is where we worked at the Fair Trade Foundation. And again, it was the same thing. We wanted to create a space where everybody from all functions of the Fair Trade Foundation could share stories together. So we had the people who get to go to Costa Rica or the Windward Islands to work with banana growers getting a fair deal for their crops. And we worked at the same time with the guys who were in finance in the London office. And all of them shared their stories of working together. And at the end of that, this man who was in finance said, you know, I just used to think of myself as, you know, just somebody who did the numbers. And now sharing my stories with everybody else, I can totally see that I am as important a part of the foundation as everybody else. It's just as important. So what I really got from that was this idea of valuing, this idea everybody has a story and it's valuable, can have a transformational effect inside any organization. And that the path to valuing somebody else's stories, valuing all those stories that are out there, whether they are in your teams or whether they are in your customers and clients, starts with valuing your own story as a leader. It's the pathway and the practice. So next time as a leader, you catch yourself saying, it's not about my story. Remember why it's important. It's the pathway and the practice to valuing somebody else's story. I'm going to tell you another story. It's 1981 and I'm in a youth club in Coventry in England in the West Midlands. I'm standing on this parquet floor that has strips of different coloured gaffer tape on it, marking out a basketball court. And the windows are high and narrow with bars on them. And the room smells of fried food and teenagers. And I'm standing on a stage with another actor called Lawrence. And both of us are there to do a play for these groups of teenagers who are in front of us. They're sitting in their plastic bucket seats. And as we do the play, they're pointing, they're nudging, they're saying things to us, they're laughing, they're whooping and calling out. And I look at Lawrence, the other actor, and I can see that he looks very angry in the middle of this scene. He's angry, his face is sweating, his arm flails about and he sticks his tongue out. And every time he does that, some of the kids go, "Oh," and some of them go, "Shut up." And Lawrence looks at me and he says, "I hate you." And I look back at him and I say, "Well, I hate you too." And he storms off of the stage. And as he leaves, I say, "Oh yeah, feel sorry for me because I'm mentally handicapped." And when I say those words, mentally handicapped, some of those kids just gasp. 10 minutes later, Lawrence and I are holding hands and we're smiling and bowing, and the kids are drumming their feet on the ground and clapping. And then Lawrence takes half of the kids and I take the other, and I'm sitting in front of this group of kids and I say, "You can ask me anything you like about what you saw in the play." And they ask me lots of different questions. And then I hear this voice from the middle of the group of kids, and it says, "It wasn't right the way that you talked to your brother in that play." And the kids around this person shifted in their chairs, and some of them whispered something and some of them laughed. And I couldn't see who was talking, but again, the voice said, "It wasn't right the way that you talked to your brother in that play. I didn't like it." And I shifted in my seat to see who was talking, and I could see that it was a boy who was about 14. He had a wide pink face, blonde sandy hair, and I could see that he had Down syndrome. And my throat tightened up immediately, and I could feel my heart beginning to beat faster. And I couldn't think what to say. I didn't say anything. And then the boy was on his feet and he was saying, "Sometimes when I go to school, people drive past me and they slow down their cars and they wind the windows down and they call me a spaz and they call me a mong, and I don't like it and it's not right." And now the kids around him were just silent, were just listening. And next to him, I could see that there was a woman who also had sandy coloured hair, and she didn't look at him. She just looked at me. And as she looked at me, I could see that she had tears rolling down her cheeks into her lap. So after the play, everything had finished. Lawrence and I were packing up, getting ready to leave, and I could see that the woman and the boy were at the end of the room. And I said to Lawrence, "That's them. I think they're going to come and talk to us." And as they got close to us, the woman said, "We just wanted to come and say thank you for your play. I hope we didn't spoil it." And I said, "No, not at all. We wanted you to speak. We wanted that." And she said, "This is my son, Joe. I've never heard him say any of that before." So that's a story that I would say is an origin story of mine. And you might have noticed in me telling you that story, or indeed in any of the stories that I've been telling you so far, this action of the mirror neuron. So it might be that as I was telling you that story, even though your experiences, your life may be very, very different to mine, that it was firing off your own memories, your own stories, your own reflections. So that's the way in to finding your story. Just notice that loop of connection. So let's get really granular, really practical. If you are one of those people who say, I don't know what story to tell. I don't know, none of my stories are very important. There are 3 places where it's really good to look for stories. One of them is an origin story. A story, or, all of us have many origin stories, but a story from the origins of you doing what you do. So that might be to do with your heritage. It might be about your geography, where you're from. It might be about your early interests, talents, early inspirations, your origin story. And then, as I talked about before, there's a milestone story. So in your journey from your origin to where you are now, there are those moments along the way where significant things happen. It might be successes, failures, changes of direction, lessons that you learned. So there are milestone stories. And a third kind of a pot of stories, if you like, a good place to look for stories, is in impact stories. What story can you tell that's going to show me your impact in the world, the impact of what you do in the world? And here, a kind of before-after story can be really useful, a juxtaposition. Show me the before, show me the after, and I'll get your impact in the world. Really simple story structure. So those are 3 pots of stories, and I'd just like to do a very simple excavation exercise. We're going to excavate your story just for a couple of minutes, because at the moment, all of you might be thinking, well, you might have a number of stories, or you might have a fragment of an idea and it doesn't feel like a story yet, and that's fine. This exercise is going to help you turn that fragment of an idea into something that is richer and more textured. So I'm going to invite you to close your eyes if you feel comfortable to do so. If you don't feel comfortable to do so, that's fine. And as you close your eyes, think about a story that you might tell. Might be a story inspired by my story, or an origin story, a milestone story, or an impact story. And with your eyes closed, just take yourself back to the main location of that story. If you didn't know what story you wanted to tell, I'm pretty sure that your subconscious has just taken you somewhere. And there'll be a story there. So in your mind's eye, just have a good look around in that place. Just go into your imaginative mind. Take yourself back into the place and look at it. Engage your visual sense to look around the space. And what details can you catch? The things that make that place distinctive, the things that make that space that space. And now open up your sense of hearing. What are the sounds of this place? Might be natural sounds, mechanical sounds, music. Might be speech. Who's talking? What are they saying? What are you saying? And now breathe in. Breathe in through your nose. What are the smells of this place? And what's the taste of this place? And if you get more from one sense than another, that's quite normal. Sometimes one sense can be a kind of gateway, can open up memories in another sense. And now check in with your sense of touch. What's the temperature of this place? Are you hot or cold? What does the light feel like on your skin? And check in with your physical sensations, because the physical sensations in your body will give you a clue as to how you're feeling in that story. And notice how powerful this is as an emotional journey to step back into a story in this way. Notice the power of that for yourself, whether you tell this story or not, the power of revisiting that place. So take one last look and listen, and then come back into our virtual circle. Thank you very much, everyone. I just want to thank you for going there, for stepping back into your story and allowing yourself to become inspired again by your stories. You know, we experience the world through all of our senses. So if you want to take someone into your story, take them there. Engage those sensory details that you've found. And that's what will take them into your story. This is a little bit like archaeology, this process. You know, we call it excavation. You will find fragments of memory and you can pull them to the surface. And this can take time. You pull them to the surface, brush off the dust, look at them, and you will have these pieces of your story which you can put back together to remember, put back together your story. So if there was anyone out there who thought, I don't have a story, I hope now that you have seen that everybody has a story, even you. Thank you very much.
Jane, this was absolutely stunning. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
I hope you guys also tried this exercise because I really got into some new places now. Thank you.
Great.
We are waiting for the questions if you have any for Jane, because this, you know, after doing this exercise, there's a feeling of like, wow, I need to just be there for.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, there was something that I wanted to say, which was that that is a really powerful exercise. So if you found yourself stepping into this story, capture it for yourself, capture it, you know, whether you write it down, whether you make voice memos, whether you have a document or on your computer, and maybe later today, find somebody to share it with, share that story and just see where that takes you. You know, you can step into that loop of connection through sharing that story that your subconscious in this moment, in me, you know, you weren't prepared for it. I just gave you that exercise and you took yourself somewhere and your subconscious took you there for a reason. So maybe share it later today. But I understand that people may be feeling tender in this moment.
Yeah. And you know, my question was exactly about this tenderness feeling, because what you gave us now is a really a very tender, that's exactly the right word, exercise that really triggers a great deal of emotional stories. And sometimes in business this is quite rare. More often I see people just rejecting telling the story, but sometimes I see people coming out from that place and telling the story without, you know, any kind of craft or any adage to it. So it just brings people back to that place instead of elevating them. So my question to you is, how can we make sure that this story that just dragged us somewhere else doesn't drag people there, but actually elevates all of us?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. And I think, you know, for people who maybe saw Dan's presentation yesterday, which was about listening, you know, at Narativ, we always start with the listening. So it's about creating, number one, that safe vessel, that safe container. And so that's very true when we are excavating stories with people. We make sure that we are creating that safe space. And also, of course, we're always saying to people, in the ethics of storytelling, you own your story. And it's not for me or for anyone else to require anybody to tell a story that might take them to that deeper place. So I think in a business context, it's about creating the listening and being able to judge what is the listening culture of this organization. And that's the first part of the work, really, because then that tells you, how far you can go. And actually, typically, people will look after themselves and tell the story that they can tell in that moment and what's possible for them to tell. The other side of that is, I think, if we know that we are sharing a story that is very powerful, is checking in with our own need to tell that story. Why am I telling that story? And how, if I think about the listening to that story, what's the impact of that story going to be? And is it ethical for me to be telling that story in this context? And finding a way to tell a story that means you can get the content and keep it safe. So again, it's all comes back to the listening to yourself, to the group, and to whoever's going to be listening to the story, I think, because then it boundaries it for everyone, particularly in a business context, because different businesses, different cultures around the world have different levels of comfort with different kinds of stories, for sure.
Lovely, perfect answer. So we just start with the listening culture, and that's actually an answer to Adlai's question about how do we make this container. So we really need to create the safe space. Lovely.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. I mean, this is such a sweet spot in terms of making communication human, but we really need to be very, very soft-handed with it and be really patient. And that comes with a um, huge appreciation of our nature. Let me give you another question there for like maybe a story eliciting question even. There are times when we like teach people to create these safe spaces. And there are times when we understand that these safe spaces need to be created because we just stumble upon the lack of it. So maybe you had an episode when you realized how important this safe space was.
Yeah, I had an experience in a room actually not too long ago, about a year ago. It was just before lockdown, where I found myself teaching our ideas about listening and storytelling in a culture that I discovered was highly unsafe, that the listening within the group was not safe. And so actually what I was doing with people felt really uncomfortable, felt uncomfortable for everyone. And what happened was that when I stepped away, I kind of felt, how could I have done that differently? It didn't feel altogether successful to me. We ended up having a positive conversation by the end of the session, with people acknowledging what was going on in the listening. But as I walked away, it was like, wow, I'm glad that I don't have to work there every day. And it was astonishing that I'd been invited into that. And in fact, they apologized to me afterwards. But they also said, because it was part of a whole week-long training for them, that they said that by the end of the week, the way that we were listening and talking to one another was transformed. And they thought that it was because of the experience at the beginning of the week, beginning to pay attention to how they listened to one another. So it was kind of like, a situation that had to be released. And in giving it air, it was uncomfortable for everyone, not least me. But actually, I think culturally within that organization, it paid off, even though it was like, let's, strap on our seatbelts, because this is going to be bumpy. Because when we come out of our comfort zone, then it can feel uncomfortable sometimes, for sure.
Lovely. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I can see that people are liking it with the fires. Wow, it's been such a ride. And the second time, actually, people from Narrative ask us to close our eyes, and something wonderful. So thank you so much for that. And we're waiting for Jerome tomorrow, but we won't get ahead of ourselves. Jane, I have the last question for you, a traditional one. So let's imagine Her Majesty the Story came to life and was about to teach leaders one thing and one thing only. So that one thing would be?
Your story matters. That's it. Your story matters.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Thank you.
So much, Jane. It was such a pleasure. Let's give our applause and thanks to Jane Nash. And it was just a showcase of real human beingness. So much.